Pardon me while I have a strange interlude.
There is nothing else. Life is an obscure hobo bumming a ride on the omnibus of art.
Along the misty corridors of time, and in those corridors I see figures, strange figures.
Welcome back, my friends, to the AP Strange Show. I am your host, AP Strange. Tonight's show is brought to you by the exquisite agony going on in my skull right now, which is actually an unintentional form of redemptive suffering so that you won't feel any pain and you can just sit back and enjoy tonight's program. It wasn't intended on my part, and I don't know how this became a sponsor, but there you have it. And it's already easing off because we have a wonderful guest tonight. This is going to be a really fun show. We're kind of talking about monsters and ETs, but magic and all kinds of things in between. My guest tonight is a historian. He's an occultist and a practitioner of Maya magic, and he's working on books right now and has actually written quite a bit and presented on the Maya practices and of religious and magical practices. I've heard him on a couple shows already, and he is just a wealth of information and a fascinating guy. Solomon Pakal. Welcome to the show, Solomon.
Thanks for having me, man.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I mean, I had heard you on The Magician and the Fool originally, and about 20 minutes into the show, I was like, God, I need to talk to this guy. He is just fascinating. So I'm really happy.
They're great hosts. They're great hosts too. One of them is a very good friend of mine, very good practitioner as well. So it was a pleasure talking with them about it and whatnot. But yeah, that was a good one. That was a long one too.
Yeah, and well, it was, and it's like you got way into the deep end with it, and it was because that is the kind of show, The Magician and the Fool, for people who haven't listened, is they get really into the nitty gritty with esoteric and magical stuff, like really the heavy lifting stuff. So I hate to say it's not for beginners, but like if you don't have at least a little context, you might get a little lost in that show in general, because they're not afraid to like really go deep and kind of assume that you know some stuff on the outset. But
yeah, well, I mean, and I thank them for that. I mean, it's like if I can say like for any like aspiring practitioners out there, or aspiring seekers, aspiring investigators, you know, at some point you got to break away from just the 1, 2, 3s and the ABCs. You do got to push yourself, and that is something that podcast did a really good job with. That I'm happy to say that was a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in general, it's there's the beginner stuff, and then you do have to expand beyond that. And I think from what I've heard from you and from chatting with you just before we hit record, it's you do an excellent job of explaining really intense concepts in a way that people could understand. So I don't know if you wanted to give my listeners a little bit of your backstory, because I mean, your personal story is just as fascinating as the things you cover. But tell us a little bit about who you are for the people listening.
A little bit about who I am will probably explain a little bit about the thought process too, about how I'm able to kind of explain those things. So I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and my mother came from Guatemala, and she comes from a lineage of what the West and modern society would call brujas, and in the colonial area for the past couple of 100 years, we would call brujas. And a bruja is basically a witch. That's what they translates to in Spanish, and brujeria is the art of witchcraft in Latin America, and it can stretch from all kinds of various schools of thought. There's, the brujeria in Guatemala is similar, but definitely not the same as it is in northern Mexico, and it's not same kind of case in the Caribbean. But what's unique about my family's lineage into brujeria is that we come from an indigenous Maya tradition, that of Cachiquel Maya descent, but uh, essentially my family was a bit more entertaining like the darker side of life and the
Hmm.
more urban side of life than some like Cachiquel Maya that are found in more rural settings in Guatemala. So when you think of like actual like witchcraft and sorcery, that is like the bread and butter of like where my family comes from. And that actually expresses itself in the essentially the immigrant mentality that drove my family to eventually move here. Like my family moved here and they just escaped the harshness of the genocide that was coming in Guatemala during that time. And they came over here through the Pan Am immigration program. So, they worked hard, they got here legally, and, they set up shop, working hard, 3 jobs a day, and just so that their descendants can go to college and have a more, prosperous life. Yeah, so I'm basically me and my siblings are the product of that immigrant mentality, but that's also the brujeria mentality, whereas it's a lot less mystic and it's much more thaumaturgic. It's more about practicality and forcing circumstances. And I'm not arguing that that is superior, by the way, to mysticism. I think there's a lot of brujas from various traditions that I got to know that could benefit from some theurgy and
Yeah.
some mysticism. Because when I was growing up in Washington, D.C., there were definitely some Guatemalan families that kind of maintained that brujeria attitude. But we also were cross training with a lot of other different types of brujeria, folk magic, and ATR uh, mystery traditions, most notably Santeria, because in the Washington, D.C. area, and this is the case really all across the United States, but D.C. is a very big melting pot, very big melting
Right.
pot. But the people who own the big shops, they're Santeria, like they're Santeros or something, or they're spiritualists in the Espiritismo tradition that are training to become receive ocha, something like that. And those botanicas are owned by people like that. So there was kind of a lingua franca to urban third world styled witchcraft and it's maintained to this day. It's just a little bit more intermixed with like Western stuff and other things. But back then it was really Santeria was the hosting party, but the majority of practitioners were actually like Mexican and Central American.
Mm.
So there was a lot of indigenous Mesoamerican traditions that were making its way into these places. So there was a lot of cross training going on. People going to each other's parties, people, dating each other's sons and daughters and stuff. So there was a lot of great intermixing and exchanging of ideas. Um, But what where my family, like, really upgraded the practice was is that, well, when you get results with magic and you get results with hard work, you manifest a better life, and if your kids are becoming more educated and you got more money, you can go on vacation now. So, my family, while is comes from a Guatemalan tradition, we were able to travel freely throughout Central America and educate ourselves on um, the various places of Maya culture and various ruin sites that were different. They were different principalities. They have different schools of thought, all very similar, but we could see how they were all doing things slightly differently, or they all had something to contribute to a greater whole. So we ended up incorporating a lot of Maya thought from the Chiapas region in like San Cristobal de las Casas, or the Belizean Yucatec Maya, or the Mexican Yucatec Maya. They're sometimes called the cult of the talking crosses. That's not necessarily the most correct way of saying it, but that's
Mm.
how they're known in the history books. And they have a very unique cosmology. that was incorporated into our practice. And then obviously, like, there's the daykeeper traditions that they're still riding strong in Guatemala, and that is a pretty diverse practice too. Not all daykeepers agree with each other. They have various schools of thought there. All of that was kind of brought together and consolidated into my family's practice because we were becoming more educated, and we incorporated a lot of straight up archaeological documentation, because there is a literacy deficiency when it comes to third world countries and particularly Latin America. But if you can read archaeological documents, the archaeologists aren't telling you how to do the spells, but they're translating spells and they're translating ritual procedures. And if you've been on the ground at these ruin sites, well, they tell you where exactly in the city that these things were taking place, at what times, certain conditions. So we could reconstruct ancient Maya rituals based off of being of the culture, but also being more Western educated. And that I do. And my mother would say that we have to tip our hats to my father, who he's American, but he was the Indiana Jones type. He was a former military man. He was a historian himself. He still is. He's
Yeah.
still got the Indiana Jones cap and cracking the whip, and he's an adventurer, and he loves culture. And Washington D.C. was a fantastic place to grow up because the Smithsonian was there. There was various kinds of immigrants moving in, setting up shops, setting up restaurants, setting up family businesses. You could really get a worldly education on the streets in D.C. So I'm very proud to be from Washington, D.C., because that really developed me to have a uh, investigative mindset about
Mhm.
all of this great mysterious stuff. So I maintain that Maya lineage, but I apply a lot of analytical and investigative thinking to it, and it's just so much more expansive than anybody could ever imagine. People think that magic, like the end all be all, like as far as the vastness is concerned, is like wrapped up in either like Western esoteric traditions or something like the various Buddhist tantric traditions, or even ATR has a very well fleshed out system. Um, and people don't think that Meso America has something like that, that Latin America has something like that, which is insane. It's something
Right.
equally as comparable, because what people fail to realize is that the land of the pyramids is not Egypt. The land of the pyramids is America. And I mean like all of the Americas. Just on the Yucatan Peninsula alone, there are 10,000 found pyramids, and there's more
Yeah.
being discovered every day. Just go on the web and you'll find it. LiDAR is the new kind of weapon of choice to uncover these ancient cities. But just in Yucatan alone. But here in Ohio, where I'm at, there's more pyramids than there are in the entirety of Egypt. There's only 120 to 140 pyramids in Egypt. And if there are more to be found, it wouldn't be anything more numbers wise more extraordinary than that, just because that's how we can survey the earth. But in places where the earth can overgrow on top of pyramids, that's where the mysteries are at. So when there's this idea of the lost world, that
Yeah.
was what was applied to Mesoamerica, and it's very much so the case. Um, yeah, and that we haven't even touched South America in this discussion. So it's like you really are talking about the land of the pyramids, and when you find pyramids, you find magic. You find societies that they they plant their foundation, their cosmology, the way they view the universe in a sense of like I don't want to say supernatural and superstitious in like a primitive way. No, I'm saying that they believe that you can interact with nature in a harmonious way that can instill change. So, America is the place for that.
Yeah. And the Maya culture was huge for that. I mean, literally, they spread a lot farther north and south than I would have thought before, because I mean I didn't know as much about the Maya culture prior to listening to the interview with you, but it's kind of crazy to me that they went as far north as like Ohio and further north than that, right? You
Yeah, and when I say that though, I do want to clarify it's the influence of the
The
Maya. And you
influence,
do
okay,
find Maya, like there have been like Maya bodies uncovered in like the Cahokia area.
Yeah.
Just and it lines up with the historical timeline. Cahokia was on the rise, Chichen Itza was on the downfall. Migration patterns, people move around like when civilizations fall. So it's not outlandish. Now, I'm not saying that the Maya had an empire or anything here. There was
Right.
never a Maya empire, by the way, but they did not have their own city state that supplanted itself here. No, it's just like Native American migration patterns are much more vast and active than what normal people may think. And so you do find people of Maya descent in the continental United States. A lot of people don't realize this, but even the Aztecs are
Mhm.
not native to Mexico. They're native to
Right.
the United States and northern Mexico, but they migrate into the valley of Mexico in the 1200s. So like they come much later than the Maya timeline, but the Maya are still around by the time they get here, and so they share some time periods together. But they are much more um they're a testament to just how active peoples were moving across this
Right.
these continents. But like even in Okmulgee, Georgia, like the Okmulgee Mountains, I've been to the museums there, and you find obsidian that comes from Guatemala. Like the
Yeah.
trade and turquoise. I'm sorry, a trade and material shows that there are various goods that have been exchanged by ancient American peoples across vast distances. And I mentioned turquoise from the Southwest, but even the Southeast United States made its way into Meso America. So like these people were interconnected in a lot of different ways that they don't really get credit for. And sadly, it's just kind of chalked up to there must have been some kind of Atlantis because that's the only way they could have
Right.
gotten together, right? And
Yeah.
it's a much more just a much more dynamic reality that we live in than that.
And
Um,
over a long stretch of time too, because we're talking about some pretty ancient stuff in some
Yeah, we're
cases.
talking about 4,000 years. And
Yeah.
the thing is that we can kind of, at this point, include the Olmec in this regard too, because the Olmec, while they're kind of seen as like the oldest civilization. At one point, they were called the mother culture, but now they're called the sister culture. And that's really not a new breakthrough, by the way. It's just kind of taken a while for it to catch on, and it's starting to catch on. But you see a lot of Olmec and Maya sites, particularly in like Western Guatemala, where the architecture, the art of the Maya looks very Olmec-y, and it just shows that these people were living alongside each other, cooperating with each other, perhaps fighting each other. But you're talking about we can at this point we can easily round it to 2000 BCE. Um, at one point, some of these, and I've even been corrected on some of these dates as of late. There's been just new discoveries by Texas A&M University that they're placing people in the Americas getting essentially getting civilization or some kind of civilization started much earlier than what was previously thought. Now, that doesn't mean hoverboards and it doesn't mean like,
Yeah. Right.
laser pistols or anything like that. It's not talking about that. But to suggest that people were active and doing more communal and civilization based things earlier than what we were previously expected. Yeah, we're thinking about that. Like, for example, like the Popol Vuh, which is one of the Maya creation stories. We have temple carvings on temple sides that dates back to 400 BCE. So 400
Yeah.
years before Christ, we have it on temple sides. And so if it was carved and finished on temple sides at 400 BCE, then that means the idea was around much longer than that.
Right.
So,
Right.
like, even if you think about construction projects today, the idea for like there's a famous subway in like New York that was like promised in the 70s and it didn't come around until like 2016.
Yeah.
Um, it takes a long time sometimes for these projects. And then DC too has like I think we had a silver line or something that's been promised to us for like 3 decades or something. And it takes a
Right.
long time even in the modern day, but the idea was there. So when it comes to like these mythological, like making monuments of mythological things, the ideas were there much longer. And with particularly the Maya, but you find this in other American civilizations as well. They essentially had architecture that were like Russian nesting dolls. where they would build on top of the older pyramid. So really, when you're looking at a pyramid, there's several renditions of it that are quite a bit older.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, we're talking right now at least 4,000 years plus of history, include the last 500 years of the colonial period. And I know a lot of people like they get the colonial period, like, and I am speaking as a indigenous person that has been racially discriminated against in my life for being indigenous. The idea of colonialism can prickle at sometimes, but it is a part of our history, and it's
Yeah.
500 years of our history at this point. So we better consider it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's absolutely uh absolutely something that we do need to note, and especially as it relates to the magical ideas, because as we were talking about prior to hitting the record button, some of these ideas and concepts have to change and adapt, or are stamped out by colonial interests. And for that reason, it's like a lot of this history is obscured. It's not things I was ever really taught about. And as you say, people are still finding out things they didn't know about the ancient cultures in Mesoamerica. Now, I feel like I've always had a difficult time, specifically with the history in Central America, because there is so much garbage out there. I mean,
Mm.
I feel like especially like around 2012, like you could not get sensible history around the Maya culture, because the market was flooded with Mayan calendar end of the world stories and books and things like that. And I kind of just shut it all out. And I do the same thing with a lot of uh, Native American tribes, indigenous people in the United States, because I gotta be sure the source is a source I can trust, and
Yes.
there is a lot of garbage out there and a lot of misconception. So I realize that that's something that you're trying to clear up.
Yeah,
You
no,
know,
I actually just wrote this past week of my section of 2012 for my book, and the thing is that people don't know when we say garbage. A lot of people don't know just like how on both sides of the aisle it is, and what I
yeah,
mean by that is that there's garbage on like we know that 2012 as a doomsday was perpetuated essentially by the far right into
mm,
trying weaving it into their Christian narratives of the book of Revelation. They interweaved, essentially America's place in like a World War III scenario with Jesus, and Nostradamus is confirming it. It became like a Hollywood hodgepodge of
mm,
things that were not really about the Maya people that were, prophesizing this so-called date. But we know that's garbage, right? We know that
yeah,
like the aliens coming down was garbage. We know that the Big Bang, doomsday nuclear bomb was going to be garbage. However, and we know who to blame for that. Like we know who to blame for that kind of stuff. But I got to tell you, a part of the misconceptions that I have to point out. I got to hold my leaders accountable, because I too struggled with this when I was younger as a young person of the indigenous diaspora trying to get back to my roots. And I'm not the only one. I knew other people. And it's a shame that even Maya elders and people that were coming from indigenous authority, like positions of authority, played into the 2012 bliss, like the bliss out and enlightenment kind of model. And they would do it in ways that I think were very, very, very alarming, and in the sense that uh, if anybody has followed the subject, they know that Jose Arguelles was essentially the scapegoat after 2012. He was the one that wrote the book, The Mayan Factor, and he was a new ager that essentially like mixed a lot of like I Ching and like Mayan calendar stuff to where it was not authentic, and you had Maya authority figures call him out, like straight up call him
mm,
out. However, these same Maya authority figures would ally themselves with other new age figures as essentially like their proxies to Western audiences to essentially like garner attention, and whether it was for paid speaking gigs or something, they too perpetuated the alien talk. Like they perpetuated like just like quite literally straight up aliens, like three-dimensional, like here, like spaceship stuff. How the Maya were like the Maya were like essentially the heads of Atlantis and stuff like that. And all of that is incorrect. And all of that is just coming from old reactionary behavior to like colonial thought. So in like the 1950s, there was this thing in Mexico called the Mexicayot movement, and it was all just like Mexican nationalism, but they would essentially make up kind of like false mythological narratives about Aztecs and Maya people to assert some kind of like essentially like racial superiority, but this time it's all like it's for the indigenous people to kind of like fight back this narrative for the sake of national pride. And there was Guatemalan daykeepers that basically took a cue from the Mexicayot movement and just started applying this to the Maya people as if like it was ancient Mayans that went to Egypt and went to Cambodia and went to India and taught those people magic and technology and stuff like that, which is, I mean, that's still racist. Like it's just
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
reversed, and it's just inaccurate because it I know the depths of the Maya cosmology and how you can apply it to actual like ritual magic. And they did not entertain even like 1% of that. They just bought into ancient aliens and Atlantis and all of these false things because that's what got the hippies excited. It
Right.
got the hippies excited. It would get like certain little mini documentaries on the History Channel and stuff around 2012, and playing into that, it was just pandering, and it's a way of selling out your culture. The problem with that is that when you come from a very poor background and the people that are native, and the tourists come in, they're like, "Oh my god, real Maya people." Uh,
Yeah.
they will pander because a pandering can get you $5 American, which goes like 3 times as much down there.
Hmm.
And if your family's dinner is on the line for the next 3 days, yeah, you're gonna pander. And people don't really realize that. They don't have a connection to the level of poverty that exists in not just Latin America, but I've traveled a lot, and it's in a lot of places, but particularly Latin America. So when you are hearing them telling you about, like, this practice and this visionary journey, or, like, a big one that's, it's mostly an Aztec thing, but it's, or as quasi-Aztec thing is, the Santa Muerte trend, right? When they're
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, Santa Muerte can be for anybody." Oh, like, "Oh, yes, we have this sacred healing shamanic cacao ceremony." They're saying
Yeah.
that, sadly, it's typically coming from a place of, they're starving and their people in their families starving, or they have medical problems or something. Um, at least that's what the common people, when it comes to 2012, I do find it a bit shameful that some of our elders, big name elders too, were really feeding into this alien stuff or Atlantis stuff because they knew it would get Western eyes on the Maya. And they were
Right.
actual, like, legit daykeepers. Like, they did legitimate rituals, and they were actually sometimes heroes, because, like, there was a genocide in Guatemala, and these people stood up to the government, and they were heroes at one point. But, like, pandering is still pandering. I'm not saying that they're not heroes. I'm not saying that they're not great daykeepers. It's just some people, like, not everybody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. But we need to. I, as a Maya person, a person of Maya descent, and as a historian, and as like a quality occultist, I feel the need to keep my leaders accountable. I'm not going to mention names here. If you really want to know, buy my book when it comes out. But
Right.
yeah, like even my elders pandered to bad narratives, which ironically have Nazi ties. It's so strange that because a lot of these like alternative theories, they were propagated by straight up Nazis. Like they were used to
Yeah.
justify essentially racial superiority as
Hmm.
hyperdiffusionism. If you claim that everybody descended from this one ancient civilization, and as long as your ancestors were on top of that ancient civilization, that's what's called hyperdiffusionism. And for the longest time, it was Aryan people that ran Atlantis. Nowadays, it's
Yeah.
kind of swapped hands with a bunch of things, but The Atlantis narrative is an old colonial. It was used as a colonial tool even before the Nazis, but it would mature into the parties that would become those kinds of like esoteric Puritans of race.
Yeah, and I mean they also did the very same practice of promoting folk traditions within Germany as like a traditionalist thing that they needed to get back to. So it's kind of similar to what you were talking about with using that kind of folkloric stuff as pageantry for whatever fascist ends they were hoping to achieve.
Yes,
And
exactly. And
yeah,
it's not beyond any certain people to dive into that kind of vanity, but it's still
yeah,
wrong. It's
oh
still
yeah,
wrong because for people that like a big part, especially of the daykeeper tradition, is like putting ancestors first. Well, we are demeaning our ancestors' achievements by playing into this alien stuff. They weren't
hmm
that. And the things that a lot of these mythological figures represent are actual like ancestral figures, or they are like higher cosmological entities that, they can't be bound up into a flying
yeah,
saucer. They are pretty almighty. So but yeah, no, that's the limiting factor of things like 2012 and Ancient Aliens, and
yeah.
the real majesty behind it is much more transcendent.
Right, because it's not like it can't include flying saucers, but it's not the one-to-one equation where this deity actually was a flying saucer full of aliens. Like
Yeah.
I think that's the major difference. Where it's really sad that we have a channel called the History Channel that mostly traffics in pseudo history. And I remember years ago I tried to give Ancient Aliens a chance, and it must have been within the first couple seasons. And I remember, I don't remember if it was Sukalos, but it was somebody on there talking and saying, well, in Mayan traditions, they had this flying feathered serpent. And what they were really describing was a flying saucer coming down. And it's like, because of course there couldn't have been a flying feathered serpent. That's just ridiculous. But, a flying saucer full of aliens from Zeta Reticuli, now that makes
Yeah,
sense. It's like, I was like,
yeah.
that's, I had to turn it off because I'm like, that's just crazy and stupid and really disrespectful.
It is, and we can explain my theory of why, and this will be good because like this was
Absolutely.
like the
Yeah.
reason. This was
Yeah.
like the real talking point that we wanted to get across, right?
Right.
Was this. So why the aliens thing is stupid and not an actual like or some kind of visionary or like ultra dimensional, like say a flat feather plume serpent or something is not dumb. So the thing is that if you make the argument for three-dimensional hard aliens like interstellar travel, right?
Yeah. Nuts
You
and
now
bolts.
yeah, nuts and bolts, right?
Yeah.
Where are the nuts and bolts? That's the argument you're having. You have to provide the nuts and bolts. And they claim that these aliens were on the other side of the world where there was metallurgy, and then here where there was towards the post-classic, there was some metallurgy going on, but it was not metallurgy like on the scale of Europe or in China. So how do you explain that big technological difference if they were both touched by aliens? If they were both touched by aliens, metallurgy should be like child's play
Yeah.
compared to like any civilization that has the capability of interstellar travel would have to have easily anything right now that we have would be child's play. Like the current
Right.
technology is child's play to that. Yeah. So the thing is that if you're talking about three-dimensional actual aliens that landed down, touched down, tampered with human DNA, and could do anything long term, you have to have nuts and bolts. And for any kind of technology that is of that scale, there would like you would see it. Like we would see it. Why can we find essentially arrowheads that date back quite literally 10,000 plus years, but we can't find some superstructure that allegedly existed? And
Yeah.
that's the problem is because if it was there, you would find it.
Yeah.
Uh, now, so what are these things? So I clearly believe in something, right?
Yeah.
Uh, what are these things, especially like when it comes down to like the cryptids and stuff. And let me just say this really quick. Like when Sukalos or somebody is talking about like the feather plume serpent or like these gods, they're really like leveling these things down, like these divine forces down. I'm not saying like the UFOs are not like what you would call the equivalent of gods, but there are clearly
Right.
some things that we even have like found footage, the security footage of things that would bridge into that kind of more like ET UFO kind of phenomenon. Yeah. But there's some consistencies with all of these phenomena. And the
Right.
consistencies is that they are very fleeting. Visually, they are fleeting. Physically, they are fleeting. And they don't really leave much evidence. What else could possibly be like that? And the closest answer that we have, and again, this is just a theory, but it is a slightly testable theory. I'm not a physicist, but I've read a lot on this subject, and it is slightly testable. And it is essentially physical dimensionality. So physical dimensionality means that like we live in a three-dimensional universe.
Mhm.
But beneath us, there is a second dimension. Beneath that, there is a first, and beneath that, there's a zeroth. The
Yeah.
zero would be a single point. The first would be a single line,
Yep.
um, and so forth till you get to us, right? So it's axes of geometry. So if I turn on a video game that's a side scroller, that's the second dimension, and I can
Mhm.
interact with it, but through a controller, through an interface. I turn it off, but I can't like go there. You know what I'm saying? It's like I turn off
Right.
the interface. I'm like I'm done interacting with the place. Now that's the thing though. It gets really trippy. Are those things somewhere in some kind of frequency of reality? Are they sentient? That's a whole nother story. But like,
Yeah.
I can interact with a second dimensional existence, but through an interface. So if there is a fourth dimension, that is not time. It's geospatial in this regard. Can something from the fourth dimension interact with us?
Mhm.
And if it does, would it not be temporary because it can't actually physically exist here? It has to go through some kind of interface like me with the video game controller and console. Because even if I left the video game controller all night, that's still not indefinite. Like I'm still not existing there.
Yeah.
The second I turn it off, the interface is gone and my existence there is terminated. And that's a similar thing to what I believe is happening with UFOs, especially like the found footage of we can touch on them later, are duendes. You can find some footage on YouTube of duendes. There's a lot of physical like angular distortion where it's like you
Mhm.
can see arms, you can see a body, you can see legs, but they don't make sense. And I believe what we're seeing is essentially a fourth dimensional or higher creature having some kind of temporary interaction with our third dimensional universe in a
Yeah.
physical way. This is not if anybody has ever heard of the old classic Flatlander. I know there's a TED video,
Yeah.
like a TED Talk video on Flatlander. Everybody should go watch that because essentially the question that is raised by a character in the second dimension is like, well, what if there's anything higher than this? And a sphere from the third dimension enters the second dimension, but it doesn't look like a sphere. It looks like essentially like this big horizon event. And
You're right.
the
Yeah.
second dimensional creature has an interaction with the sphere, but it's not a sphere. It can't comprehend how the sphere actually looks like in its true form.
Mhm.
So, I believe that explains a lot. I say explain with like like a lowercase e because it's like all of this is like still very theoretical, right? Um,
Yeah.
but I believe that that is a big thing, like a bit like a very, very good horse in the race when it comes to starting to have discussions about cryptids and ETs. That's what that those things actually are because their interaction with our physical universe is very limited. It's very like it's very in and out, and that's how they like you can disappear without a trace is that if your physical dimensionality is completely gone. But if you're talking
Mhm.
about interstellar travel, if we shot a rocket to Mars, the remnants of something will still be there. And the other thing is this too, like if you really want to scare yourself, you should subscribe to a YouTube channel called Astro Kobe. He's an astrophysicist his videos are really fun and scary, but it,
Yeah.
it goes over like the actual like the horrors of the physical universe and like physical distance is just such a physical distance is so crazy. It is
Hmm.
so humbling. And
Oh yeah.
like and Neil deGrasse Tyson is on this too. He's like, you know, if we've got the money to make a wormhole or transform another planet into Earth, we've got more than enough money to fix the Earth because
Yeah.
to make it economically like an economical payoff to travel someplace else and like to set up shop someplace else, it would be mind-bogglingly expensive. Like, we can't even really realistically think about it right now,
Hmm.
despite what Elon Musk wants to think. Um, uh,
Yeah.
uh, that that kind of interstellar travel and actually making it like long lasting, it is more than likely not going to happen until
Right.
like maybe there's like some kind of material uh gold mine that has yet to be discovered. But it would have to be better than anything that we could imagine right now. So physical distance is something that really cannot be taken lightly
Yeah.
because even light, the fastest thing in the universe, is subject to the distance between us and other places.
Hmm.
And if light is subject to it, and it's the fastest thing in the universe, I think any alien spacefaring civilizations got their work cut out for them to get here. Um,
Yeah. And the way I've always looked at it is, if you could create an Einstein-Rosen bridge or wormhole or anything like that, for the purposes of travel, well, then all bets are kind of off, because at that point you've manipulated physics to a point where time travel is also on the table.
mm,
You may not exist in a visible spectrum when you do travel somewhere. That's so. I mean, I think the nuts and bolts idea of actually just traveling through space, um, without the aid of something like that is uh, well, it's astronomically improbable to me.
yeah, that,
You know,
that's why it's like
yeah,
they're looking for Dyson spheres, because
yeah,
you would need an energy source it that no planet could probably be able to generate. Like the greatest sources of energy out there are like stars, right? So like that's why
yeah,
they're looking for
yep,
Dyson spheres. And like if because even for like wormhole stuff, right? Like you would probably need a massive energy source. So like even to get that going, you probably need something like a Dyson sphere. Again, this is all hypothetical, but to kind of bring it round back to the Maya of like why this is all and this is can be applied to any culture, but like the Maya have a vibrant roster of things that I would consider are of that kind of ET cryptid extra dimensional entity. The Maya have a large roster of them, but it's all kind of encased with the theories of geospatial magic. So, what I mean by geospatial magic, and this is like my distinction of it, but like if you were to ask an indigenous person or even an anthropologist, they would just kind of we're talking about four directions at its most rudimentary
mhm,
level is the four directions or the four corners. And in Meso America,
yep,
there's technically, depending on how you chop it up, it's actually like 5 to 7 directions, depending on how you want to word it. But there are typically helper spirits or some kind of spirit that corresponds to each direction. Now there are actual like directional principalities. Like there are like this represents like a divine representation, right? And we were talking about
hmm,
emanation theory. So like there are the divine representations of the directions. That changes depending on Maya region, and the mythos kind of changes depending on Maya region, but they're largely similar in scale. But then you will have essentially like maybe like you could say nations or tribes of certain spirit species that correspond to directions. And so that leads me to believe if you look at the correspondence there, something about direction corresponds to dimensionality, to geometry. And geometry in other places or other dimensions dictates a lot of what's of how things are characterized. Because you
okay,
will find like one of the favorite ones are duendes, which are essentially elves or dwarves,
mhm,
Maya dwarves. In some Maya city states, there was dwarves for each direction, and they were essentially called upon for help. And they were, from what I have examined in the mythology, they are approached differently than like the jaguars of the directions or the giants of the directions. So, depending on where you go in the Maya world, sometimes they're called the Alush or Alushop. The Spanish word is duende, but like they're also called the Chahaleb in Guatemala. Sometimes they're called Sisimite, and that's actually comes from a Nahuatl word that has to do with a Nahuatl entity. But that one's a little weird because it's actually it can be either a duende, like a very small creature, or it can be a
Hmm.
very big creature, like Bigfoot. Essentially, it's essentially Mexican
Okay.
Bigfoot. Uh, so it gets kind of confusing with that one. But these are creatures that like we could pull up found footage on YouTube where you see the geometries around them and the geometries that make them up are distorted. And why are they distorted? And you see on the same footage though that everything else is normal on the camera. I believe the distortion comes from like their geometries are not agreeing with the geometries of this physical universe. So that's why they can only be here temporarily. Just like how I
Hmm.
can only be in Super Mario temporarily.
Right.
But when I'm there, I'm a G, right? So that's kind of like uh, a trade-off with dimensional superiority, right? Like essentially, if you come from a higher place to a lower place, you have you have privileges that the inhabitants don't.
Yeah.
In a game, I can grab special items and I can essentially be stronger than like the inhabitants. And again, this is theory. I'm just not saying
Yeah, I mean, you have a outside perspective almost. You have like an eagle eye view, and you're privy to things that the people in that dimension wouldn't be able to see at all.
yes, and
Um,
that's why that's very consistent with how the Alushob or the Duendes are called upon. And I'll tell you, like, so there's plenty of legends about duendes, and one of them is with the pyramid of the magician in Uxmal, where it's said that a wizard conjured an alush, and the alush built the pyramid of the magician there. And now that's a legend, right? But it's a testament to just how powerful uh, and how long lasting the tradition of duendes and alushob are in the culture, especially for sorcerer types. And I'm
mhm.
not saying gatekeepers don't mess with alushob or the Chahaleb, but like the Alushob and the Duendes and stuff, that's very big in Brujeria. That's
Yeah.
it's a very well preserved kind of it's a very well preserved trick in Brujeria because like my abuela essentially had relationships with Duendes and she was very coy about it. But there was
Mm.
always a reason why she kept coffee flavored candies on her at all times. And those like
Yeah.
strawberry hard candies. It's essentially like there's kind of like a witch's relationship with these dwarves, and they
Hmm.
are like this is a long-standing tradition. You find these dwarves carved on temple stones, find them carved on ancient pieces of jadeite. Um, yeah, so that's a really long-lasting one. But there's other types as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. Interesting also because I'm not remembering exactly where it was. It might have been Venezuela or maybe somewhere, maybe in South America somewhere. But there, in the 50s, you had some UFO occupants that were described as like hairy dwarves in like South America. So it's kind of interesting that that's what would happen down there. You know?
Yeah, and that
um,
matches up with the descriptions of the Siti Mite.
okay.
They're hairy dwarves, hairy gnomes.
Huh.
Um, and then there's some testaments of that they're huge. So it's like they kind of go back and forth with that one. But the duendes are typically like the vernacular for like the short guys. The alushob in
Right.
Yucatan, short guys. So but Mite that can kind of go both ways as of right now, just because like that's like the stuff we got on. But there's plenty of cryptids. So like there's another one like I know we've mentioned Ishtabeob, and
Hmm.
so and this is a great way to get into emanation theory too. So La Llorona is a folkloric spirit, but the people on the surface looks like a clash of cultures, like a colonial era spirit, which most certainly has a big tie to the early colonial period,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
which is straight up legit. It is she is a product of the clash of cultures, but her um first appearance really is in the Popol Vuh, and she is the anthropologist and linguist Dennis Tedlock does an excellent job tracing the origins of the La Llorona tale to these two female figures that they fall into tragedy essentially in the Popol Vuh
Hmm.
by a riverside, and they are essentially condemned in a very like they're also associated with a lot of like sexually explicit kind of attributes. So, that kind of sensuality of La Llorona is carried on through this original tale. And, Ted Locke and I have to agree with him, I believe that this is the actual origin of La Llorona, but one of the names of the 2 characters is, Ishpuch, and, this would eventually become the assertion is that this would become the goddess, quote, unquote, "goddess" Ishtab. The problem I'll address this right now. So, uh there is a kind of a decolonization efforts to remove the word God from like the Maya lexicon. I personally don't
Okay.
have too much of a problem with the word God or deity, but I do see the reason to decolonize the verbiage because we do have legitimate pre-Columbian or indigenous words to describe divine forces. Some
Hmm.
people would argue
Okay.
that we don't, but my family as well as other Maya traditions would argue that there is.
Yeah.
And I believe
I feel
the
like with European outlook on things, anytime there was an attempt to understand an indigenous religion or just a religion that was outside of the realm of like the Abrahamic traditions, they would always try to find like a corollary. It always seemed to me that they wanted a one to one, like, so what's your heaven like? What's your
yeah,
God like? What's your devil like? And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. It's a total
it,
it's just clean slate. Start from a clean slate and actually listen to the people so they can tell you what their religion is, you know?
yeah, yeah, because the thing is that when you start confusing all these terms, it's like basically you can slap the word God or deity onto everything.
Right.
And I'm trying to assert in my work that we start relabeling these gods as Yumsiles or Yumsil for singular and Yumsilob for plural. This
Yeah.
word we really got traction from the Belizean Yucatec Maya, the Khrushchev Maya in Belize and in
Okay.
Mexico, because Yumsiles and Yumsilob basically speaks to like the plurality of God, and Yumsil would be a singular manifestation of a divine personification. Not everybody, not every Maya person, not every Maya group agrees with that verbiage, but that is the verbiage that me and my lineage subscribe to, and various Maya lineages subscribe to. And I believe that is such a healthy and beautiful word to use because it's not unlike how in Santeria and in ATR from West Africa subscribes to the word Orishas. Now, if you called them gods, it's not really incorrect, but at the same time, it's like that's not. It doesn't seem to be the natural inclination, even with Western people, to refer to the divine figureheads of Yoruba religion as
Right.
gods. They typically revert to Orishas. So, like, I tip my hat to the ATR religions because they've done a great job maintaining their cultural pride with that word to communicate the divine without having to replace it with a deity or God. But at the same time, they're not too angsty about using it in discussion, referring to
Hmm.
these things as gods or deities as in discussion to have comparative analysis. So I tip my hat to the ATRs, but like so. Returning back to the Maya with Yumsiles and Yumsilob, Ishtab is a Yumsilob, is a divine personification of some kind of force of nature, but also a higher conceptual thing.
Right.
And in the Dresden Codex, she is famously pictured hanging from what is known as a sky band, and she like literally has like a noose around her.
Uh-huh.
And what she's actually symbolizing is an eclipsed moon. She is the moon hung in suspense. So this was to denote some kind of poetic tragedy, essentially, and the character is consistently associated with tragic happenings.
Mhm.
Since the Popol Vuh, tragic happening. Even in the colonial period, when you're talking about like a woman that drowns herself and drowns her children, and then is a ghastly creature in the night, it's
Mhm.
something that's wrapped up into tragedy. I do say that like her story is tragic in various ways that I don't think other I'm not trying to compare here for the sake of comparing, but like she's a very misunderstood spirit because she was never like a lot of those associations, like the really like ghastly associations come colonial period.
Right.
She was clearly much more of a cosmological face that denotes like cosmological, like celestial
Mhm.
events happening prior to the arrival of the Spanish. And but this is a essentially Ishtab would be that higher emanation version, right,
Right.
of this divine face, this Yumsil. La Llorona or Ishtabayov is essentially like the wraiths, like the spirit species that emanates from it. Just like
Right.
we are human, right? But at some point on the conceptual level, there is the idea of human, but we all come from that idea of human. So
Right.
she comes from this idea of tragedy in a plural form. So La Llorona, right? So La Llorona, I really suggest everybody in the audience go on YouTube and look up for some found footage of La Llorona because I have never seen a cryptid, and I've asked other people and other practitioners. We've sat down and watched La Llorona footage for like a night out because there's just not a cryptid or ET to my knowledge that is more consistently on film in ways that
Yeah.
like you can't like it's not kids messing around with like some paranormal activity kind of like a hoax. It it's so consistent with how they show up and where they show up. And it's creepy. It's very creepy.
So what does it look like in the videos?
They're typically uh kind of like that movie The Grudge of like a female
Okay.
with long black hair with the face
Yeah.
covered
Yeah.
and very slender wearing a wet white gown and
Mm.
the footage can it's chased people before and
Right.
the way that it's chasing it defies physics. Like you can tell it's not a person because in order to run that fast, you would have to actually like have a sprinting posture. And
Right. Right.
the footage is good enough to where you can see there's nothing beneath the individual. And before somebody brings up drones, some of this footage like predates the availability of drones, like for the common
Yeah.
person. And
Right. Right.
also too, I wouldn't like a lot of this footage comes from third world countries where like buying a drone is like at least a month's salary. So I don't believe it's a lot of those are hoaxes. I think that it's just a spirit that is very, very. It's a type of spirit that is very, very responsive and
Yeah.
very alive, and that is like kind of is bridging into those that geospatial makeup. It comes from yeah, that's La Llorona, but and
Uh,
yeah, just I suggest people go look at it, and it's not something. Those aren't spirits that you don't want to mess with, and I will say that like so like Ishtab is a part of my practice. The Yum Sil, Ishtab is a part of my practice. But that does not mean La Llorona is a part of my practice.
right.
My grandfather, my abuelo, he had a strange relationship with certain spirits of Maya folklore, and La Llorona was one of them. So the thing is with La Llorona, she actually has a like a body count. Like you'll find in certain definitely Mexican and in Guatemala City essentially police logs that show people that have disappeared in association with La Llorona sightings. So
Wow.
like there are entire police logs about this. And so the folklore goes is like La Llorona spirits would um essentially be waiting outside of like by riversides or by woodsides that are next to bars where there would be womanizing men, and she
Hmm.
would like seduce them into the woods, and they would never be seen again. And
Yeah. Yep.
uh cuz I think it was also cuz like my abuelo, he was very he himself was like a folk practitioner of these kinds of things. He had a very strange relationship with certain spirits, that being one of them, because he was one of the only people that would see and interact with these Ishtabayob and come back alive, or
Mm.
not go missing.
Right.
So, so yeah, but he had relationships with other spirits as well that bridge into this cryptid ET, like extra dimensional thing. So like the other two big ones would be Los Cadejos and El Sombreron. So El Sombreron, I'll get to that one really quick. El Sombreron is essentially like the Hispanic Ghost Rider. There's legends that uh, he was a musician that sold his soul to the quote unquote devil
Mm.
to
Yeah.
be the best mariachi or the best musician in like in the world. And then there's also that he was like a horseback rider racer or a bicycle racer, and he like sold his soul to be the best. So he essentially is like this skeletal figure on horseback that goes and collects the debts, collects souls for the devil,
Yeah.
and he can be met at the crossroads. And sometimes he's like really short and like smelly, and then sometimes he's like really dapper and tall. But he's very skeletal in his appearance. Sometimes it's skeletal makeup. Sometimes he is
Yeah.
just like straight up like Ghost Rider. Um, but he wears
Is
that
he
kind of
wearing? Oh, I was gonna
okay.
ask. He's wearing like kind of the mariachi outfit.
Yeah,
The
mariachi or a banda style
Yeah.
outfit, uh, like black and silver, and he's always on horseback. And
Huh.
there's footage of him too. There's actually a really good shot that is crazy good on YouTube. One that was really captured well. Not there's not as many of him as like La Llorona, but still, there was
Yeah.
just such a good shot captured of him. But so in Mexico he's known as El Charo Negro, but I think even in Nicaragua he's known as El Charo. But in Guatemala he's El Sombrero, and he has a big sombrero, and he can be playing the mariachi and stuff. So like the thing is that I don't believe the idea of the devil, again, this is like a really bad thing about colonization where it's like they brand a lot of like just mysterious crap the devil, right?
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
not. From what I have been able to research, I believe he essentially sold his soul or something, or made a deal with a certain Maya Yumsil that has a very long history in Mesoamerica, who is pitch black himself, and he is a merchant god of the underworld. And he's
Mm.
still kind of petitioned to and made deals with. He's kind of like an underworld like mafia boss.
Right.
But he is a Yumsil. He is would be of a deific kind of nature. And he essentially made a deal with this entity at the crossroads, and now he collects the debts for this entity. And ironically, because it's all about debts and commerce, and this
Hmm.
deity was one of commerce and mercantilism uh,
Huh.
in pre-Columbian America, and is still venerated as such. Actually, this deity is a narco saint today, and not just a narco saint. Mashimon is the contemporary name, or San Simon, and you can
Okay.
find San Simon statues in United States Botanicas pretty easy. But Mashimon is we can trace him back to several pre-Columbian Maya deities. Some of the names are Ekchua or Haalchua or Bolonyokte. There's a lot of different names that he went by. He was a very active deity. Um,
Hmm.
so, but uh,
So he would be
s-
petitioned for like business if you wanted a success in business or
yeah,
business dealings. Yeah.
yeah, and
Okay.
and really today he can kind of be petitioned for basically anything. But
All
his
right.
specialty was riches. It was like status. It was
Mm.
all kinds of things, but it was typically things like that. He was a god of the underground. He was a merchant lord of the underworld is what he's called sometimes by archaeologists, and it's because he was just like he was a Mac, like he was kind of a pimp.
He
Like
he was the godfather of the.
yeah, no, no, no. He
Yeah,
was like he was like the Don Corleone of
yeah,
of
yeah.
Xibalba of the Mayan underworld. So he's got like a mean streak about him. And again, a lot of these things, a lot of these like gods, deities, deific masks, and Yumsiles, if we stay with the decolonizing right. Um, in practice, as a practicing magician, they're not like superheroes. Like they're not like the Avengers. They're more
Right.
like strange Lovecraftian horrors or something like. And when I'm talking about Lovecraftian horrors, I don't necessarily mean they're evil. I just mean they're very, very strange. Like they're
Yeah.
so strange that even if they take more of like a human kind of appearance, it's something that's very otherworldly and like by our modern standards we would consider unnatural.
Hmm.
So, for instance, the Maya maize deity, Yumka'ash or Funalye, he was the god of maize, corn. And corn is very significant in Maya cosmology because
Hmm.
humans are made of corn, a mixture of the god's blood and corn. So the thing is that a lot of this human elongation of skulls trace like the reason is because of the Yum Ka'ash, the Yum seal of corn, because his skull in mythological depictions is like this raised, elongated to resemble the corn stalk because it's
Right,
what
right.
provides life. It's the crop of the Americas.
Yeah.
Civilization owes itself to corn, just like civilization in the Near East and in Europe would owe it to wheat, and in the Far East would owe it to rice. It is holy because we wouldn't have smartphones if it weren't for corn, rice, and wheat. So because we needed that first to jumpstart civilization. So, but like that idea of elongating skulls, and again, that is not ETs. That is sorry, Sukalos. It's not aliens.
Right.
It's it is a ritualistic admiration for this life-giving essence, which is crazier than just like three-dimensional alien overlords. Like it is
Yeah.
crazier. It's
Right.
we mentioned Clive Barker before we hopped on the podcast. There is an element of kind of like we would call it body horror. Like
Right.
there this idea of in some kind of spiritual transformation through physical transformation.
Hmm.
There's a lot of that in Meso America with like the flaying of skins and just like the offering of blood, the elongation of skulls, a lot of the body piercings. In Meso America was where we first had teeth jewelry, grills, like the first grills
Yeah.
from Meso America. The first gauging of ears and whatnot, crazy piercings and crazy tattoos. That is all limit experience. And that is more of like what these Yumsiles embody is that kind of alien. So we take for granted tattoos and piercings these days because like, we can just like kind of go and do it. But back in those days, it was very easy to die from infection. So it was an alien experience and a transcendental experience to go through something like getting tattooed or elongating skulls, something
Right.
like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
So
A lot of it was a rite of passage for people. Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that rite
Yeah.
of passage, that passing through the like coming to touch the numinous. That's alien. Like that's
Yeah.
very different.
Yeah.
That is actually alien. And I don't mean like phoning home. I'm talking about it's an experience that takes you to someplace else while your body is still here.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of these deities and otherworldly entities like embody, especially like we were talking about Yumka and not just Yumkaash, but the deity of which El Sombreron like sold his soul to. Like, and
Yeah.
that one in particular has like a very crafty personality. I like to call him he if I was to pick a character from literature that embodied how like Ekchua likes to act, it would probably be like Nyarlathotep from the Lovecraftian mythos, where there's
Yeah.
just like this kind of very dark sense of humor. Um and how
Mm.
it views humanity, but it's also like an ancestor. That's the thing. A lot of people in Guatemala, they see it as an ancestor. They see Echua or Mashimon as grandfather. They quite literally just call him grandfather. And he is that, but he's like this it's very, I would say it's highly conceptual and almost like Neoplatonic, as far as like the grandfather goes. It's the grandfather. I don't want to say archetype, but for lack of better words right now, I'll just say that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I could see that. That makes a lot of sense. And to your point about Lovecraftian nature of a lot of this stuff, uh, I don't think people realize in general how subtle a dimensional shift could be to be completely unnerving. When you get into Lovecraftian stuff, it's like the non-Euclidean geometry idea,
Yeah.
where things are just warped a little bit, even if it's just a little bit. But we're talking about a dimension that's kind of inconceivable to us, which just means that encountering it without proper preparation is just going to make your mind literally explode.
Yeah, and
That's
it's
why
not that
everybody goes mad at those.
it's really not that unbelievable, because here's the thing. We live in a three-dimensional universe, but ladies and gentlemen, your eyes don't see in the third dimension. Because if your
Right.
eyes could see in third dimension, you could actually see through whatever you're looking at. You could basically see all around it at the same time. Our
Yeah.
eyes see things in a two-dimensional kind of lens. We can tell that there's depth and height there, but we can't see around the depth and height. And if we truly had three-dimensional vision through our eyes, then we could see all around the object we're looking at.
Hmm.
Um, and that's kind of trippy, right? But that's something
Right.
that we can relate to, because we know we live in a three-dimensional universe, but we can't see three-dimensionally.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I
we
mean,
can kind of use that.
anybody that's ever had to wear an eye patch for a day can tell you how disorienting even just that can be, because you need
Yeah,
both eyes.
yeah,
It's like
yeah. To have
for the depth
equilibrium.
perception. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So one more cryptid I want to talk on, just because like we were talking about my abuelo and his there's a type of cryptid called Los Cadejos, which means white dog, black dog. And
okay.
the legend goes that, if you're out at night and you see a white dog, he will lead you to essentially like a better night. He might lead you to some treasure, but usually he'll lead you to safety. And then if you
Hmm.
see a black dog, he'll lead you to your doom. And Los Cadejos are a long-standing myth throughout Mesoamerica, because they have to do with they do correspond to the day sign of Sit or Ok, which is one of the Maya astrological um, time periods. We have, the sacred calendar has 20 days.
Right.
One of those days is embodied by this day sign Ok, but it translates to dog or sometimes footprint. But it's this idea of essentially like man's best friend in a conceptual sense, uh, of like going to a destination or being led to some kind of like destination. Now, why Los Cadejos is actually like I would say conceptually important is because a big part of Mesoamerican cosmology is this idea of duality. So duality, I know in like Western occultism, duality is kind of the idea is kind of looked down upon, but duality in Mesoamerica has the highest regard. And I'll explain why they actually are basically like there shouldn't be any friction with it. But duality, the highest place in the Maya heavens and the Aztec heavens as well, is called the place of duality. And this is because you have everything in nature has a complement. It has a push and a pull. We have, a light and the dark, if you want to say it. But there
Hmm.
are cooperating components that get the universe and existence going. This goes all the way up to like your supreme divine masculine, divine feminine. And the reason why duality is emphasized and not essentially unity is because it's basically unified anyways at the top. I
Okay.
like to say, think about like in alchemy, you have the holy androgyne at the top, and it's because
Yep.
it's both things happening at the same time. And I'm not trying to say, oh, that's it, and just like say it's equal, but it's a good concept to use when thinking about Mesoamerican cosmology.
Okay.
Um, that essentially duality at its highest form is unity anyway, because it's all happening at the same time eternally in perfect harmony. And if you read the Popol Vuh at the beginning, at the creation of all things, it has essentially dual pairs of creative forces being listed out. For every one, there is another, and it's cooperation. And this is why a duality is important, is because if Mesoamerican focus on duality because it gives equality to, and I'm not saying in a woke sense equality, I'm saying in a very natural and divine sense, equality to the divine masculine and divine feminine. And the Catholics really tried to stamp this out during the early colonial
Yeah.
period. They came up with this symbol behind me, Hunab Ku, which translates to one God or soul God. And it was just a way to draw attention away from the divine they to the divine
Mhm.
he eventually,
Right.
even
Right.
if it was a more ambiguous figure, because we can see it through the early colonial period that they made it synonymous with the god Itzamna, and then they said, "Oh, Itzamna is this one true God's son," and then it left out Ixchel, who was the goddess of the Yucatan. Um, and foregoing the divine feminine essentially foregoes the harmony of nature. If you ignore the feminine and you just have like this idea of like all powerful manhood, uh, it throws nature out of balance, and that is
Mhm.
not how the indigenous Maya wanted to live. They wanted to live in harmony with their environment. Not all the time, because there are certain, like we have evidence that there was times where they didn't have the best farming practices and it wasn't the most harmonious with nature. But the overall cosmology was clearly about harmony. And that only comes when these cooperating forces are equally addressed and equally respected. So that is why there's such an emphasis on duality. Is that's kind of like a paradox of duality. Is only when you have harmony you do have this kind of ethereal unity, but you can only reach that if you have harmony between both sides. And that's honestly what Los Cadejos, in a kind of a horror sense, represents, in kind of like a horror story, in almost like a Stephen King fashion. Los
Yeah.
Cadejos kind of illustrates that in that kind of narrative. But yeah, the Mesoamerican cosmology, there's a greater lesson there, and that's Mesoamerican cosmology runs on this idea of duality and holy duality. There's nothing wrong with you. There's a divine mother, divine father, divine grandmother, divine grandfather, and the creator couple of in terms of creative forces emanates. Everything emanates from that place of duality. Because if you
Yep.
just had one thing, really nothing in nature is made from just this one thing. It is a cooperation of forces.
Yeah. I mean, that makes complete sense to me. So, with these um, dog spirits, this is something your grandfather interacted with too.
Yeah, yeah,
Y-
Los
Yeah.
Cadejos, you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And these
Uh,
things would be, you would see them and then they would be gone the next kind of minute. So it's like they fall
uh,
within the vein of, this geospatial extra dimensional kind of creature. A lot of folkloric stuff from I'd like to designate it folkloric because they're clearly not deific. They're not of that like apex
mhm.
conceptual nature. They're much more interactive, right?
Right.
That's why I like to section it off. My approach and what my work is going forward is about systemization with the Maya cosmovision and Maya cosmology. The reason is because, um, well, there's a lot of reasons. One of them being efficiency, but and also that our ancient ancestors did that. Like they very much
Mhm.
systematized things. There's kind of a there is a sentiment amongst certain indigenous groups or like even well, it's mostly that of that
Yeah.
essentially Mesoamerica was not as systematized. Um, but the thing is that we like quite literally have it like in stone that it was highly systematized. I
Yeah.
think the idea of where it wasn't as highly systematized comes from is really the colonial area. Ironically, for for all the efforts to kind of dismantle that and get back to indigenous power, the idea of like essentially humble, or at least the majority of Maya cosmology being like this kind of humble rural setting is because of the colonial period.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I don't know about other people, but I'm trying to be like King Pakal, and I'm trying to be like Lady Six Sky. I'm trying to be like um, Fireborn. I'm trying to be like the Snake Kings of Kalakmul, and they lived in like these palaces, right? Like they
Right. Right.
they
Yeah.
lived in these massive city states where they were, encrusted with jade, and um, had crazy ritual regalia with quetzal feathers, and you don't run rituals that involve cities of 20,000 plus people, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, at precise astronomical times that correspond
Hmm.
with astrological correspondences by just feeling it. You don't
Right.
do that. Everybody's got to show up on time, wearing the right uniform for the right mission, and that takes systemization. And the Maya were all about that. The numerical system by itself is proof. They had systems. So, the systems, they largely agreed with each other. Like the Mesoamerican calendar was pretty widespread, but some of them had their own preferred systems.
Hmm.
Like Nagualism was a type of system, a magic system that was preferred by certain people and certain rulers. That is something that has survived in Brujeria. Like this idea of lycanthropy. It's essentially
Yeah.
Mesoamerican lycanthropy. But that's a completely different system than, like, let's say, like just the time magic, working with the calendar. It's very different
Hmm.
from that. Now there can be some cross pollination, but it is sometimes you can just completely do it. Like my tradition largely didn't have anything to do with the calendar, so but they could still interact with Nagualism. So there you go. You can
Yeah.
definitely distinguish systems from each other. And for if you have a spiritual practice, uh, especially if you have a spiritual practice, like just kind of feeling it, that's when you're dabbling. That's when you're a tourist. If you really want to like experience something real, and if you want it to actually like better your life, you should approach it just more professionally. Like it doesn't mean like you got to wear a suit and tie to the ritual chamber. It just means like you got a plan. You're going to execute as best as you can. It doesn't mean everything's going to go according to plan, but at least you got an outline and you got an idea and you're well informed about it, and you go about it and you do it, and that already can increase results by like 20%. So I'm a
Yeah.
big advocate for systems, but there's various systems to the uh the magic of the Maya. That's why when I say folkloric stuff, I'm kind of for the sake of conversation, the sake of approachability, uh putting El Sombreron, Los Cadejos, stuff like that into like the folkloric category.
Right.
But the other reason why I'm a big advocate for systems is like we talk about misconceptions. When you have people that say, "Oh no, you need to stop thinking like that. Stop thinking so critically, or stop thinking so like outlining it like this. You just need to trust. Just need to trust the elders or something like that." I have
Hmm.
respect for a lot of my elders. I really do. I'm very proud of a lot of things they did, especially during the genocide. And how they like really they were performing rituals where when it was illegal and it was punishable by public execution. I'm very, very I'll tip my hat, I'll clap and be very
Hmm.
respectful. But at the same time, I and a lot of other indigenous youngsters around 2012 suffered because of that mentality. When you have this trust the elders mentality first, that's how cults get bred. And I'm talking about like bad cults. Like
Hmm.
I'm not pulling this out of thin air. Like there's people I have a friend who is a blossoming figure in the more danzante community, danzante Azteca communities where they do reenactments
Okay.
of Aztec dance. And there's plenty of stories of like quote unquote elders putting their hands where they don't belong
Yeah. Yeah.
on the opposite sex or the same sex. So it's like that kind of just trust the elders and just like run with it kind of thing, just be completely intuitive. That's a breeding ground for stopping you, conditioning you to stop thinking critically, and it hampers your results and it puts all of your power into whoever the leader is.
Hmm.
And that's not good. I believe in strong leadership, but leadership means that you also like delegate leadership. It means you have to trust people to do certain tasks on their own. And that's a different kind of leadership than just trusts whoever,
Yeah.
has this
Well,
initiation from an oral tradition. Um,
it
so
sounds
that's
like
why
there's
I'm an advocate.
accountability. It sounds like there's accountability in your model as well.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think everybody benefits from the kind of thing you're doing because it can be a teaching moment for people outside of the tradition to learn about from the outside, but also people within have kind of a structure to work with previously maybe unavailable in the way that it's all put together with the historical background plus the categorization and the way it's compiled. I mean, I feel like everybody benefits from that, whether they choose to stick specifically to it or not. So
Yes. Because the thing is that despite indigenous knowledge of any place on Earth, humans are still humans,
yeah.
and leadership will have to. And leadership has different styles, but leadership is still largely like there's patterns to it.
Hmm.
I'll tell you a story of, like, why accountability is important. I was in the military for 10 years, and I got to handle part of the withdrawal from Afghanistan that happened, just a few years ago, and I was in a meeting with a bunch of generals, and I was handling a lot of logistics, and when the Taliban were taking over Afghanistan again, the first thing that they wanted to talk about was doing an airborne drop into Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne. And it's like they could just shoot at us. Like they have like tanks stuff now and they could just shoot at us. But they weren't thinking about that. They weren't even thinking about communicating. They wanted essentially a promotional kind of like banner of like some kind of thing to put in the newspapers kind of thing, like
Right.
a
Right.
triumphant return and a Trump triumphant withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it was just such a shit show. Like, we would me and my, platoon sergeant at the time were, like, trying to tell the colonel to tell the general how stupid this idea was, and, because otherwise guys would have gotten killed.
Yeah.
And part of that whole mess, I remember, was I was in, like, the command center, if you will, like you see in the movies where, like, Morgan Freeman's on this big wall of TVs and,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, all the military people are, like, behind desks and, like, these rows. I was in, like, one of the guys in the rows, and it wasn't that fancy, but it was, like, a small version of that. And they put up on the TV, it was before it ever hit the news, I got to see it first. The planes taking off and the Afghan civilians holding on to the planes
Hmm.
and falling off, like,
Yeah.
from hundreds of feet in the air. I ran out. I ran out of the building. I just threw up on the grass, like, right outside
Yeah.
the building. Um, and the whole thing about the war on terror is a bad, exercise in leadership for, like, 20 years. And, that trying to do an airborne jump into Kandahar was about to be another bad leadership decision. And there was less it was about accountability because they were generals, they didn't have to make the jump, and they thought they could get they thought they could pull it off while, like, getting good tabloids and, like, it would look good for their promotion if they could
Hmm.
pull it off. Or, like, even if it wasn't a promotion to general, that when they leave the military, they can become a general manager at, like, Boeing or General Dynamics or something
Yeah.
like that. They have a
Right. Right.
very cushy 6, seven-figure job and
Some
easy.
lobbying job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, leadership, especially in something that is requires trust because it's all unseen arts. All this esoteric stuff is unseen.
Hmm.
There needs to be a level of accountability because people trust you. Like, if you position yourself as a authority figure in the occult, which it does not take much. If you start a YouTube channel, people will
Yeah.
see you as an authority figure.
Yep.
And if you start a payment plan for a YouTube channel, but you say, "Oh, I'm not a professional magician, but here's my Patreon or something." But whatever happens to you, like you did do this thing, I'm not responsible. But here you can
Hmm.
pay me for it. If you get paid to do anything, that's called being professional at it.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
if you're not a professional and you want the benefits of being a professional, but you don't want the responsibilities of being a professional. Benefits, but not the responsibilities. And that's where things get hairy because this occult field is very unregulated. And I'm not calling for like some kind of regulation or anything, but I'm calling for people to step up to the plate to be leaders. And that's what I'm
Hmm.
planning on doing. And I understand it's like it's the Wild West. It's been the Wild West for the longest time. You know, it's not as wild as it used to be, I guess. You know, like Law Milo Ducat and Jason Miller, like all these guys that
Oh
contributed to
yeah.
like the paperback revolution have certainly increased the standard. And but
Hmm.
I would like to increase the standard even more. So leadership is a big part of it. And I think 2012 and all of this Atlantis stuff and ancient alien stuff, like it's a big mismanagement of leadership because they're pushing these things, and it's more than just dollars. It promotes racism, like it comes from like Nazi stuff, like,
Right.
and people aren't doing their research. So
Yeah. And that's something I've tried to point out whenever in my writings on any kind of weird stuff I happen to be writing about. And I've had people try to tell me before, none of this is political. And they say, "Oh, this the paranormal isn't political, or the magic isn't political, and stuff like that." And it's just like, it's history. It involves people, and it involves culture. So yes, I mean, we need to be respectful all the way around. It's incumbent on each of us to be as accurate as possible, as respectful as possible, and to hold each other accountable, and to hold ourselves accountable to some kind of standard of quality, you know,
yeah, yeah, because
and
like
empathy. Yeah,
yeah, maybe for some people it's purely educational. I'm sorry, purely entertainment, but
right.
it's wrapped up into like there's real world consequences for this kind of stuff. Because the thing is I again, you're not for some reason people believe you're either on team science or you're team spirit. And if you're on
Hmm.
team science, you're sucking the fun out of everything, man. And that's not the case whatsoever. Like
Yeah, and science
again,
can be pretty damn fun.
what we touched on tonight about like the geospatial and extra dimensional stuff, that's not even like quacky quantum physics. That's actual physics. Like
Right,
it
right.
it actually complements all of the magical stuff that we talk about. But if you see it as just black and white, like it's them versus us, you're never going to see the true magic there. So that's why it's like I try to take what I learn from science and apply it to all of this stuff. Because make no mistake, like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye, they're not going to like what I say. They're still
Mhm,
going to point out the holes in what I say. I'm like, yeah, like I don't know everything, and I'm not trying to get them to agree. But I see, like, as somebody that comes from an animistic culture, I see the divine in what they are saying. They just don't perceive it like that, and that's okay.
mhm.
That's
Yeah,
okay
they're
because
speaking
I
a
come
different
from
language. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so, like but there is, like, real consequences to all of these things. I mean, clearly in recent political elections, uh, the ideas of conspiracy and, various kinds of topics that we talk about make up a large percentage of the voter base that, had to do with the outcomes. So,
Yeah.
clearly, this stuff is important because people are thinking about it, and it influences their worldview. So, we should do all we can to best inform people's worldviews that have to deal with the strange and unknown.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. It's very much true, because understanding it is the first step to pushing it in a healthy direction. And
Yeah,
you can't stop. Um, you can't stop people from thinking a certain way or spreading ideas, but you can process them. And we can talk about them. We can have community where you realize the impact, the negative impact on this, on groups of people, whole groups of people, and whole countries, and just say that we should just be able to say this is pretty fucked up over here. and
Yeah.
not have to have an argument about it on Twitter for 10 days, So, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you said it more eloquently than I just did,
Well, I mean,
but
comparative analysis is the way forward at this point. Like, so I was a combat sports analyst as well, and I
mhm,
see where the occult and esoterica is right now is similar to where martial arts was in the early 1990s.
oh,
Whereas before
interesting.
the early 1990s, it was all about like what Bruce Lee said he could do, or what people fantasized he could do, ninja stuff, death touches, all of this like crazy stuff. And then once we got enough people in a quote unquote laboratory setting and could test out what one-on-one combat could look like, we had actually a data pool to pull from. What that was called was the, at the time, Ultimate Fighting Championships. So
Mm,
now we have a large body of data to pull from what does one-on-one combat look like. And it is much more of a dynamic and unpredictable, but you can see the results and where they come from. It's not unexplainable
mhm,
results. So like I would have to like when I was a combat sports analyst, I worked for a now defunct essentially like a betting agency that operated in the Midwest United States, and they would put a lot of like high stakes bets on like what the outcomes of fights would be. So I was just one of the analysts working for those people, and the essentially the subtleties and the real life experience that I found in martial arts corresponded to a lot of the same live nature and variables that happen in magic and ritual settings.
mm,
And I've applied the same formulas I used in analysis. And I was an amateur kickboxer and MMA fighter myself. Um, I've been able to apply the same principles in magic and make it work. So that tells me that there's actually a lot more similarities in the esoteric arts of martial arts because again, remember before the 1990s, even through the 1990s, it was a lot of conjecture. It was a lot of
right.
theory and fantasy. But you get enough testing data and through comparative analysis, and now you start to see patterns. Doesn't mean you can predict everything down to the T. It's still
Mhm,
a very unpredictable sport, just like, anything to do with like reality hacking. Um, but you start to see patterns. If you can see patterns, now you can make it much more predictable. You can actually get better at it because patterns and apply. How do I offset these patterns? How do I negate these patterns? Same thing. So,
yeah.
I see us in like that early like 1990s stage right now where the people have upped the standard as I mentioned, and there has been people from various traditions that are training together. I have a group here. We have a group ritual that's coming up this weekend actually. And we come from all different backgrounds. ATR, um, traditional Kabbalistic, Jewish Kabbalah, Solomonic, another type of grimoire tradition, and myself, Indigenous Maya, and but we all have similar frameworks. It doesn't mean we're a hodgepodge of just like eclectic, like let's put a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's like no,
Yeah,
we have
right.
very professional frameworks and principles that we abide by. That's why we get along, and that's why we can
Yeah,
do
yeah.
rituals together. Not everybody can do rituals together. It's there's a lot of trust and there's a lot of criteria that's got to be met, and people got to be on similar levels.
Yeah.
Um, but what I'm trying to say is that a lot of those like X factors and variables that you can't see in magic, they're there in martial arts. And now 20, 30 years later, we know what those variables are much better than we did in the 1990s. And I think we can have a similar thing going on with esoterica. It's just there's more hurdles to overcome because now you're dealing with things that have to do with religion and just more fragile situations.
Mhm,
So but I see the same patterns is what I'm saying. I take things from an analytical and comparative analysis, um,
mm.
vantage
Well,
point.
that's a hopeful message. I mean, if we can all of us magical weirdos band together one day, have more understanding and better methods and better ways of cooperating.
Yeah,
I see that as only being a good thing. Yeah.
the great thing about the United States of America is that we have that thing called the First Amendment, which
Yeah.
means the freedom of religion and the freedom of assembly and
Hmm.
the freedom of speech. And the freedom of speech can be very abused, but assembly and religion I am a fan of. The second that that is taken away from us, we are no longer a democracy, we will be a theocratic republic, just no
Yep.
different than like Iran. So we have to protect that by celebrating our differences as different religions because we're all the minority. And I
Absolutely.
say religion, and I know people think that's a dirty word. It's only a dirty word if you let the conditioning of other religions impact you.
Hmm.
Because at some point, every cult, like all these religions were a cult at one at one point.
Yeah.
And they just like essentially got enough funding to not be called that. So they got
Right.
the blue check mark. They got the meta blue check mark from from governments to be called
Yeah.
religion instead of cult.
And the mystic and esoteric and magical traditions are so interwoven with with religion. You really can't throw it out completely. You know.
Not at all. Like Elizabeth, she has a very she's essentially has a mystic Christian path.
Right.
So the thing is that Christ, for as being people have this like Toby Keith idea of what Jesus is like in the United States, like in the Bible Belt, but to what it means to Christian mystics like her and like we have even Magician the Fool, right?
Hmm.
Janus, one of the co-hosts, he has a very like Christian mystic path. What Christ represents is so much more provocative and so much more like thought provoking and jarring than this idea of complete safety that coddles you every Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. I mean, Christian hermeticism and mysticism is all very fascinating and something I kind of resonate with, having been brought up Catholic. I think a lot of it
mm,
makes sense to me. And it has been very attractive to me at different points in my life. So I can absolutely understand that. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned like Kabbalah too, traditional Jewish Kabbalah. I mean, that's you can't really separate that from Judaism. It's all of these different things, or tantric Buddhism stuff that's going to come from very specific parts of Asia and their Buddhist practice. But that stuff makes its way into almost a separate kind of magical practice for some people. So you really can't separate religion from religion. Isn't necessarily a dirty word. I
yeah,
think.
no, it shouldn't be. And I think that we actually face more problems when we do that than if we just kind of like owned up and like studied the history. This actually
Yeah.
has to do with the Maya. The gentrification of history or the gentrification of religion can be very poisonous. So
Right.
a lot of people's idea of like Far East religion, right, is just New Age cultural appropriation. A
Hmm.
lot of the people have this idea that Buddhism is completely negating everything out external, and you're completely focusing internally on your internal divine and stuff like that. I'm not saying that's not a part of it, but Buddhism, various practices of Buddhism have vast cosmologies and very
Hmm.
bloody cosmologies,
Oh yeah.
pretty metal cosmologies. And that's the same thing with with like Meso American stuff. People think like, oh, shamanism and like psychedelics and going out with a medicine man and being like at one with nature and stuff. And it's like having very humble kind of humble experiences out in the woods or something. And it's like, yes, that was there. But what was more prevalent was probably the 10,000 plus pyramids, like the metropolises, of
Yeah.
which, there was very rich people. And not just very
Mhm.
rich people, but rich sorcerers and like just
Yeah.
culture was rich in different ways. But there was
And as
also
you alluded to,
struggle.
right?
Yeah,
And
there's
as
human
you alluded,
sacrifice.
yeah, as you alluded to earlier, like 10,000 people at one time, basically participating in one big ritual.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
and a lot of these things are like exactly, but and that's like a lot of it's more visceral and like just metal than like what the West like fetishizes it to be.
Yeah.
And this goes
Yeah.
for like there's a big fetishization of the Far East that did not
Yep.
like uh,
It's been
a
going on
lot of these
for over
ideas.
100 years.
Yes, yes, and it definitely hit a heyday with like the 1960s, and
Yeah.
it's a bastardization for what it actually represents out there in the indigenous
Mhm.
place where it comes from,
Right.
Tantra and whatnot. But the same thing
Mhm.
goes for Meso America. People want to deny that, like, and I've heard this even from like diasporic Maya people that are trying to get back to their roots. Some, not all, because there are some people that do the research and yeah, Mesoamerican history was bloody, but they want to say I've heard people say that the ancient Maya they didn't have they gods, they didn't have governments, they didn't human sacrifice wasn't a thing. That's all propaganda from the archaeologists. And it's like there's an entire 800-year period called the Classic Period that was all about worshiping the king as like a
Yeah.
divine intermediary, like being he was basically like your quarterback uh
Mhm.
for divine warfare. To say they didn't have government, are you kidding me? Like they didn't live in some kind of like hippie utopia. They had currency, they had an economy, they had
Mhm.
housing, they had public health care and stuff like that.
Right.
Um, and yes, they practiced human sacrifice. Like that's true. It happened. Like it may be like a controversial part of our history, but we have to own it. Like that really
Mhm.
happened. And it's deeper, like, and that's a whole there's misconceptions around that as well. A lot of people think that it's just like, oh, they were just sacrificing a bunch of people by the day. Um, well, first of all, like there's a lot of nuances to that. First, Aztec human sacrifice was not necessarily the same as Maya. And the other thing is that people forget it's the ancient world where you can die from an infection from a paper cut or something the
Right.
size of
Yeah.
a paper cut, or
Yeah.
child mortality. Children would be born premature or sick. And to keep this child alive was to prolong its suffering. And it would prolong the suffering of the entire family because now it's eating up resources.
Mhm.
So they know that the time is coming and they send the child off to the next life to end the suffering. How this took form? More than likely took form as like a sacrifice to a god or a
Mhm.
Yunsil, a divine figure. And that wasn't all the case. Yeah, there was like straight up like human sacrifice. So it captured people, captured royalty or captured generals, be sacrificed to the patron gods of the city. There was
Mhm.
that. There was also volunteers to be like the Aztec have a famous tradition of where a dude would get chosen to represent Tezcatlipoca, and for an entire year, he would be given the finest food, the
Mhm.
best luxury, the best alcohol, the finest women. And then on day 365, he's got to get sacrificed on top of the temple because he was
Yep.
essentially buttered up like a turkey for the gods
Yeah.
and was sacrificed. But it was a ritual. Like, again, I'm not saying it was all pretty and I'm not condoning it necessarily, but it was clearly more important. It wasn't just like grab the nearest person and we're going to sacrifice them to this bloodthirsty god so we get something in return. It wasn't that. It was a sacred play.
Yeah.
So and
And
but a
people
lot of
have the
people
well, people have the Hollywood picture, I guess, of somebody kicking and screaming as they drag them up the temple and throw them into a fire or something like that.
yeah, and I mean I'm
It's
not
just
saying that didn't happen.
but
That clearly happened in like the Star what are called the Star Wars in
yeah.
the classic period. And it happened in the post classic as well because there was much more Aztec influence at that time. You got to understand Aztec society was very different from Maya society.
Hmm.
But and I'm not trying to throw shade on the Aztecs. It's just like it's the truth. It's the truth. Their society ran differently. Um, but a lot of people don't know the like when it comes to like the child sacrifice or like the sacrifice of the elderly or some other person. It's the ancient world. Sickness, mortality, guys. At the turn of the 1900s, you know what the average life expectancy was? 40.
Yeah.
Like, and that's in
Yeah.
1900 average. Now, there's definitely some old timers, right, that would, outlive that by a lot, even, but it's not the average. Like, it's not the norm. People get sick with strange diseases in ancient times. People like get mortal injuries that like destroy their lungs. Like, if they break a rib, it may never heal in the ancient
Hmm.
world. You
Right.
tear a meniscus, you may never be able to walk again. We didn't
Yeah.
have that
I
kind of
mean, it
level of
was
surgery.
practically a miracle for a family to have more than one surviving child. You know?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
why it was, prioritized, like, across
Right.
all cultures, right, to have, like, a
Yeah.
big family because you don't know who's gonna last.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we got to kind of wind down here. This has been really fascinating. It went in a lot of directions that I didn't expect to, but I had one note that I definitely wanted to cover that this is kind of circling back because we already talked about like the deity associated with corn, but just because of my personal tastes and my personal daily consumption is the coffee, the role of coffee in ritual, and the kind of deific entities associated with that. I had a note to ask you about because you had mentioned it briefly as in one of the interviews I heard from you.
So, I think it was, okay, so, as far as, this is kind of like the cacao thing, there was no, like,
Right.
straight so the thing is, okay, it gets a little complicated because I know that these cacao healing ceremonies are, like, all the rage these days, of which there is no legitimate cacao healing ceremony that is legitimately
Okay.
Maya. Um, just I'll give the spark notes of this, it's going into my book. Um, the cacao ceremony thing was made up by a Canadian New Age figure named Keith Wilson in 2011, and he
Right.
essentially introduced a bunch of culturally appropriated Eastern practices and mixed it with, like, cacao, and saying that the ancient Maya did it. Later on, he actually made a video testimony basically saying he made it up, and it's on his website, but people don't look into it, and he basically started the whole cacao boom. However, is there a legitimate regard for cacao and by extension coffee? There is, but it's more like the Japanese tea ceremony than it is like an actual, it's not a shamanic thing. And there is an actual, I guess, a ritual that involves cacao, but I would say it involves cacao. It is not a cacao ritual, and that's important because and this ritual will be going in my book. The purpose of the ritual is actually like a sacred crop ritual where cacao takes a secondary seat to the more important crop, which is corn. It's
Okay.
Ishim, because Ishim, we are created from Ishim. And we had a deity that symbolized rebirth and abundance through this sacred crop. So to place cacao and to place the focus on cacao instead of corn, Ishim, that is sacrilegious, and that is
Okay.
racist. So and that comes from, like, rich Europeans, Canadians, and North Americans that are perpetuating this, and they still got their cacao businesses in the La Laguna area of Guatemala. But, coffee and coffee, I bring this up because, so was there a god really quick, was there a god of cacao? There was in the sense that, we already mentioned him, his name was Echua, but he was not like this like, how cacao would be used and how, like, I use cacao in my rituals. It's not, it's an offering. It's just basically an offering, because it was currency. And even in the legit cacao ritual that involves the other crops, the concept of currency is essentially conjured by using cacao. It's a currency.
Okay.
So it's a deeper concept. It's a deeper concept than like a shamanic journey. It's to say that everything in life has a price. We're constantly paying prices for it. Now, let's get to the fun stuff about the coffee because like I love coffee myself, and coffee is a big thing in brujeria. It's a common ingredient to do spells and stuff. There's a like my abuela used to say, my abuela. I just used to call her abuela because when I was a kid I couldn't say abuela as like a child,
Right.
so then we all just called her abuela. And there's some weird like brujeria things going on there too, but that's another thing with the name. But my abuela would say that a Guatemalan breakfast is either a tortilla and a coffee or like a piece of bread and coffee. So like real poor people dinner, or sorry, poor people breakfast. But coffee, you gotta understand, especially in a society that was not so stimulated, even the little bit of caffeine would induce some kind of psychotropic behavior or some kind of stimulus. And you even see this in the Arab world. At some point in the Arab world where like Arabian and Ethiopian coffee becomes a bit more of a staple, you see the art and Islamic art start to change and become more abstract. So,
Hmm.
coffee in of itself is psychoactive in that regard. I use it like that, and I know that sounds boring to a lot of people that like, you know, place stamps on their tongues and whatnot, and they want something trippier. I
Right,
will
right.
say that the Maya did have a remedy for that, and it was coffee enemas, and chocolate enemas too. But it was really the coffee enemas that really got them going. And I've heard anthropologists say like there are no like hallucinogenics in Central America, and that's definitely true. Is like ayahuasca is not Central American; that's South American, and
Hmm.
these culturally appropriating individuals have brought it to Central America, but it is an import. However, in Oaxaca they had salvia, and Oaxaca traded a lot with the rest of the Maya world, so I'm pretty sure that you find some of it there. But the real mainstay would be like tobacco, alcohol, and like boofing coffee enemas, and that's a way to open the gateways. So
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
more seen. Uh, uh, Coffee has a. I bring up the cacao thing because the way cacao is really regarded is not as a goddess or a god. It is seen as like an animistic guardian. That's really the word that they like to choose for is an animistic guardian. And coffee is similar. It's like an animistic ally that has a
Okay.
personality and or I should say it has an agency, not necessarily personality, because I like to reserve that personality moniker for like the actual Yumsi Lob, like the actual deific
Right.
figures, because they're like highly personified, right? They have like a
Hmm.
character to them.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but coffee is seen as like essentially a plant ally that you talk to because even for my rituals, I talk to all of my ingredients. I basically like ask their permission to be
Mm,
used, because there is a level of consent that is involved with the universe.
mm.
Um, like kind of like that, like with the vampires, you can only let them in if you invite them in.
Right, right.
They can
Yeah.
only come. So it's something like that, to be quite honest, but in an animistic sense. So coffee is approached like that as a sort of spirit, as an animistic guardian, and it was used as a way to. I mean, it's pretty trippy. Like, the results are pretty trippy. Like, it's not like ayahuasca, where you have to go through, like, an entire 30-day encampment to prepare for it or something, but the effects of, like, boofing coffee enemas are gonna send you someplace. They're gonna send
Yeah,
you to the
yeah.
moon somehow.
I mean, yeah, it is pretty wild. I think for now, I'm not going to be that adventurous. I'm going to stick to just drinking the hot
Oh,
stuff.
come on. I'm just kidding. I'm joking.
I have to work my way up to it, but uh, yeah, I mean, this has, like I said, this has been fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground, and we have been talking for a bit. And I'm sure we could talk a hell of a lot longer. But you have, I guess, a whole series of books planned. Is that right?
Yeah, right
That's what's
now
on
I've
the
got,
horizon.
yeah, my first book will be out this year. I'm hopefully trying to get it out by the summer. It's going to be called Modern Mayan Magic: Rituals and Rites for Spiritual Life. It is a introduction into Mayan magic. The rituals will be like practical sense, but the discussion on misconceptions is probably the most important part. It basically serves as shadow work for the entire culture going forward. Because I I'm planning on a 10-volume advanced magic series. But the thing is that if we don't get on the same kind of articulation about what we know about the Maya to be true, and then all of this kind of fabricated stuff, the advanced stuff doesn't matter.
Right,
So
right.
we need to, but I do mean it by advanced stuff. Like it's actually, and I mean approachable advanced because I'm talking about like this 10-volume series distinguishes the systems, but also they are to volume is supposed to be essentially like a Liber Spiritum. The book
Hmm.
is supposed to be magic. So I'm gonna
Yeah,
have to.
yeah.
I'm planning on doing like they have to be bound pretty sturdily, right, and be pretty
Mhm.
premium. So, but that's I have to pave the way for that. Like clearly, with especially with all the cacao healing craze, people are just all kinds of wrong. Like people are culturally appropriating, and they don't know they're culturally appropriating, and that's okay. Like I'm trying to inform, because
Hmm.
people have been led astray. But it's we got to get away from the false stuff, and because that's McDonald's, man. That this cacao stuff is just giving hot chocolate to people. That's really and saying it's spiritual. It's
Right, right.
not actual spiritual practice. It's actually pretty blasphemous, as I said, because they're placing focus on cacao when they should be placing focus um on ishim and
Hmm.
corn, because that's the actual
Yep,
holy
yep.
crop. So I'm planning that. I'm planning on I wish I had it ready by the time of the interview, but it'll be ready like towards the end of March. I'm gonna have a Substack available, and my website will be up. On my website, I'll have a selection of a few courses that they are more practically magically inclined, and they're practical in a broad sense. So I bring in some Maya stuff, but I have I have a very broad experience. I've traveled and lived around the world and practiced various things, and so I take a lot of the fundamentals and condense them. One for wealth magic, one for love magic, one for general manifestation and magic, and another one is working with spirits. So I'll have like those courses up and available probably like late March, early April. I want to have a Substack available so that I can, uh, especially all this Mayan stuff. I understand that it's not like Western esotericism, that there's a long legacy of literature. There is like a legacy of literature for Mayan cosmology, but it's mostly like it's like the Popol Vuh. It's like holy texts and stuff like that, and they can be very hard to understand. But like coming from a brujeria background, I know how to make some of this functional for people and make it approachable and
Yeah.
practical for people. So I'll be like having more of a presence in the coming months, online, like through YouTube and Substack. And I'll send you
Okay.
the links when that's ready, and then maybe you can post it along with the interview.
Yeah. I mean, I think auspiciously enough, this will be released around that time or the end of February.
Oh,
So yeah. So
okay, cool,
yeah.
sweet,
So
sweet.
um,
Uh,
yeah. So that all sounds wonderful. I look forward to your book's release when it comes out because as I kind of said earlier in the chat, listening to you talk about it, I get it. I feel like I'm getting stuff, and then I'm like, I'm listening to it while I'm driving, and I'm like, I need to be writing this down or taking notes or something. So I'll be very grateful to have a book that kind of I can refer to instead of, trying to keep it all in my head. But you are very good at breaking these very complex um, topics down to something that people can understand, and I think it's a great service that you're doing for esoterica broadly, but specifically for your own culture and dispelling a lot of the misconceptions out there and helping people that want to learn. So I very much appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to it.
well, thank you. I
So,
mean, like, and I, I'm thank you for the kind words, and I'm just glad to have like be in positions where I can talk to individuals such as yourself and like break bread on like the mysteries of the unknown, and like this is what makes being human fun, exploring the
oh hell
unknown
yeah,
together. So, one other thing I wanted to I think your audiences will love this is this book here, Mexican
okay,
Monsters by Robert Bitto, and to go follow Mexico Unexplained as his YouTube channel. Robert Bitto is a good friend of mine. He's a fantastic researcher, and he dives into a lot of the unexplained stuff, that specifically Mexico, but there's a lot of Maya stuff and a lot of Aztec stuff, a lot of Meso America stuff. Um, on his YouTube channel, there's like some cryptid things there too that we didn't get to go over, like Wei Shivo and stuff like that he goes into. Um, he would be a fantastic guest for this podcast as well, because he's got a lot of strange experiences. Uh,
oh hell
that
yeah, yeah. I'll have to hit him up and try to get him on at some point because that does sound great. And yeah, so thank you very much for coming on, and I'm sure I'll talk to you soon. I'll catch up with you online.
all right, sweet.
All right.
Thanks again.